Awesome. Awesome. All right. So welcome everybody to the first webinar of Center of Excellence in Astrobiology at Amity University. And I'm very glad to have to start this year with a very exciting, full of energy and close friend of mine from Australia, Luke Steller. Hello, Luke.
Hello.
So good to hear from you. And let me start by, so Luke and I go quite, I think we're almost half a decade now. We've known each other for 5-6 years, I think since the time I was in Australia. Luke is a PhD candidate at the Australian Centre for Astrobiology at the University of New South Wales. And he was also a part of the 2016 Spaceward Bound India expedition. And the samples that he collected were for his honors thesis. And I think he had a great time, and he's going to talk a bit about that, I'm sure, about his experience in India. And his PhD research now is centered around testing origin of life reactions in geochemically realistic conditions. And he's been partnering with Dave Deemer and Bruce Deemer from University of California, Santa Cruz, who are some of the frontier scientists when it comes to this area of astrobiology. So with that, over to you, to Luke.
Amazing. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Perfect. How's that? Can everyone see what's going on there?
Yep, all good.
Yep. Amazing. Yeah. So thank you so much, Sid, for the introduction. As you said, Sid and I go way back. He was really when I was just an undergrad, I was really in my last year of university. Sid supported me so much in getting me to India and getting me up to these hot springs in Ladakh, which have really, it's opened up my eyes to the power of astrobiology, but also collaborative work. And I hopefully will talk about that a bit today. So my talk today is all around the origin of life from a geological perspective. And we'll get into a bit of sort of depth about what the origin of life is, why we should care about it, and why can a geological perspective really help us understand it. But first, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who've been feeding into this massive body of work. As Sid said, we have Bruce Damer and Dave Deemer, who are really the forefathers in this field, looking at a new way of understanding the origin of life. On top of that, we have Martin van Kranendonk, who's my supervisor here in Australia. We have biochemists like Sudha Rajamani, Albert Fahrenbach, and Anna Wang. We have hot spring fossil experts like Tara Jokic, and modern hot spring experts like Kathy Campbell from New Zealand. So I'm definitely just a baby in this amazing group of people that are coming together and trying to really think about how did life form here on Earth? And what does that mean for looking for life on other planets? You could really say that these are the giants whose shoulders I stand on when I talk to you today. So even though I'm involved in a lot of this research, I take bits and pieces from their research and I talk about the, I guess, this scientific movement as a whole. So please don't think I've done all of this in the last 1.5 years of my PhD. I'm not that ambitious. So yeah. So really, I guess the question is, before we get started, is who cares about the origin of life? Why would you come and sit here today other than to listen to me talk and to maybe have some great questions afterwards? And it's free, for me personally, there's 3 real drivers to why we want to understand this question. And the first one that I find quite compelling, it's a fundamental question for humanity. You've had philosophers, you've had scientists, you've had artists sitting around for as long as we've been humans, as long as we've been thinking, and really trying to understand what's our origin? Where do we come from as a society, as a species, and as a planet, as a biosphere with all the different life on this planet? Why did that come about? What made it here? You can get into lots of different aspects of the why, but we're really trying to figure out the how here today. How did that all come about? The second important thing about the origin of life is that it can help us understand if we are alone. Not alone as in separated, as hopefully some of you might be social distancing wherever you are in the world, but alone on a cosmic level, if we're alone in the universe. So for any astrobiology nerds like myself listening in today, you'll see that we have the Drake equation up there. And that's really just a way of trying to figure out what's the probability of finding intelligent, detectable life in the universe. And one of those little numbers there, when you try and times up how many planets there are and how many stars, how many of those stars have life, how much of that life has radio communication that we can detect, one of those little numbers is how hard is it for life to form on a planet? And without knowing that, without knowing how hard it is for life to form, it's really difficult to understand if life should be present everywhere in the universe or if we're really unique and we're really special. For the people listening in who don't care too much about equations or that kind of stuff, basically we're just looking for ET. We're trying to really understand what's the chances of something else off our planet that we can have a conversation with. And hopefully understanding the origin of life will get us a bit closer to figuring out if that's possible. And the last one that you always have to put in grants when you're asking for money is that there's potentially amazing spin-off products from understanding the origin of life. When you think about the origin of life and drilling into really what makes biology the way it is, how did it all form, there's really no way of knowing what they would do to shape the way we understand medicine, the way we understand biology. And I think in general as well, this process of fundamental research, just trying to figure out more about the world around us, can give us, I guess, amazing bits of insights that we could never imagine that would help the world. A good example that I always like to think about is the process of PCR. So that's a way that they can sort of do testing and sort of multiply genetic material to understand what's there. And it's one of the key ways that we test for COVID. The enzymes and the process that we understood PCR from was developed purely out of someone getting a bit of bacteria from a hot spring in Yellowstone in America and thinking, why can this survive in such hot conditions? And from that, they've really seeded this entire new technology called PCR. They weren't thinking about trying to make a new kind of technology when they were looking in hot springs. They were purely just doing it because they were excited by what kind of slime grows in these bubbling pools. So I think that even though at the moment there's no direct application for origin of life research, I think it's good for us all to stay curious and to keep trying to understand the world, because maybe one day it may really help society. So the big question then, if we care about it now, what is the origin of life? So really it's this whole process of going from non-life. So that's materials or processes that have no contact to biology, they're not developed by biology as well, to life, to a living, replicating cell that can undergo Darwinian evolution and evolve and get more complicated over time. And to be fair, as a scientist working in this field, we really have no idea. We've kind of scratched the surface. We've got a bit of an idea of the general concepts that you would need to understand to figure out this question. But really, we're still in the very baby steps of this field, which is exciting because there's all this new research that we can do as emerging scientists in this space. So the exciting thing about this process is that there's so many different fields of science talking about it. You can go to an origin of life or an astrobiology conference and you'll have physicists there. And those physicists are saying that that movement from non-life to life is all around energy and information. And it's purely a question of physics. And if they can get the right equation, understanding the entropy of life and all these other things, they're going to figure out that question. In the exact same conversation, you might meet a biochemist who says that process from non-life to life is all around metabolism and biochemical reactions and trying to understand these complex systems where chemistry can fit together to start making something that looks like life. I bring my own bias in as an environmental scientist because to me, non-life is really the environment. If you think about the Earth, 3.5 to 4 billion years ago when life was getting going, it really was just rocks, water, meteorites, some organic soup floating around, and maybe a little bit of fun sprinkled in there like lightning or like dense amounts of ammonia gases or other things like that, or really intense compacts from meteorites that can spark some exciting reactions. But other than that, it really is just a simple environment that can come together in just the right way to produce life. So that's why, in my personal humble opinion, that understanding the environment or the geology in which life formed is going to be one of those really important keys to unlocking this huge question. So when we talk about the origin of life being a question about the environment, the next question is, well, in what environment did life form on Earth? So there's a few theories out there. Everyone's trying to have their own idea of what's going on. I guess one that you may be already very aware of is the idea of deep sea hydrothermal vents. So these were discovered around 50 years ago or so by these submarines that would send down there to the bottom of the ocean. And rather than seeing this sort of dead, lifeless ocean floor, they saw these volcanoes sticking up, bursting out all of these amazing, not even gases, but these dissolved minerals and sulfur and all this kind of stuff coming out from it. The water is around 400 degrees Celsius. It's so hot, but it's not boiling because there's so much pressure of all this water on top of them. It's this incredibly hot, chemically rich, amazing systems that they never thought would be down there. And what was even more fantastic, living around these vents are all these amazing life. So you have these things called tube worms that filter feed. So they eat little bits of bacteria that are floating around in the water, and they suck them in and feed off them. You also have amazing stuff like crabs and shrimp that live down there totally in the dark, totally just eating these tube worms, bacteria, or the tiny little microscopic organisms living around them. So the really amazing part about these vents is that when scientists started to study them and their ecosystems and where the food comes from and where it goes, they realized that it was pretty much a closed system. As all of you would know, that on the surface, we have a food cycle where sunlight gives plants food. You know, plants can turn sunlight into sugars and energy through photosynthesis. And then from there, consumers like us or cows or other animals can go along and eat that. And then animals eat other animals, and you have this whole process starting from that. But the base production comes from the sunlight. Down there, there's no sunlight at all. And all of that production comes from purely the chemicals coming out of those vents. So if we go up, you can see these vents of all these chemicals spilling out, and there's bacteria that's adapted to living in these vents that can eat all the metals or the sulfur or these reactive elements that are down there and kind of speed up the chemical decay, speed up the rusting, or speed up the chemical process that naturally happen. And as they speed them up, they can kind of piggyback on that, take out a bit of energy and use that to live. So there's bacteria down there, they grow, those worms can, those tube worms can eat those bacteria, they can live, and you have entire ecosystems living from that. The really cool thing about this is that if the sun went out for some reason, or if you had another massive volcano or asteroid collision on Earth that sent up all this ash and blocked out the sun, everything on the Earth's surface would die. You know, without any sunlight, we wouldn't be able to get any food. But down here in these deep sea hydrothermal vents, they will keep chugging along and keep doing their thing and not care about sunlight at all, which is remarkable, really. The question is, oh, here those crabs again. The question is then, Bud, did life evolve there? Is this where life formed? A lot of people got very excited when they first found these vents because they're highly chemically active, they're really extreme environments. And they thought, wow, these are so alien. Maybe this is where life formed. However, recently in the last 10, 15 years or so, there's a few issues that are coming up with these vents that may limit them to being the place where life could have formed. The first one is that the ocean is too salty. As some of you may be aware, if you have a cell or a protocell, if you're trying to get life to form, you need to have these little bubbles, these little membranes around them. And those bubbles are called lipid membranes. Now, a lot of lipid membranes, if you try to form them in really salty environments, they kind of crush up and can't form these nice, beautiful balls that can encapsulate stuff. So cells living in the ocean have to work really, really hard to push out that salt, that they keep pumping out the salts and keep the ion balance working, which would be really difficult on a, on a very primitive level. So they think these environments may be too salty for those first cells to form. Also, these vents are too dark. As you know, that down in these deep sea vents, there wouldn't have been any sunlight down there. That's why they're chemically driven. But we know early on from the fossil record, which I'll talk about a bit later, that photosynthesis happened quite early in the Earth's history. So for life to evolve down there and to float up to the surface, to float up through kilometers of this desert of no energy from chemicals, no energy from the sunlight, and to survive and get to the surface and then to quickly adapt to harnessing the energy from the sunlight, that could be too much of a jump to go from these chemical consuming bacteria or the first life up to photosynthetic or bacteria that uses sunlight. So these vents, they may be too salty, they may be too dark. As well, the oceans may be too dilute for all these meteorites that are delivering organics. it's really well known that there are meteorites floating around in space that are constantly cooking up bits of carbon to form nice long chains like these fatty acids that can make these protocells, they can make amino acids, they can make all different kinds of carbohydrates and stuff. And they're getting constantly rained down onto Earth and delivering these really amazing organics that could have made help life form. But if they're falling into a big, vast ocean, they would start diluting and they wouldn't really be concentrated in these vents. So these vents do have a way of producing their own organics. They can cook up carbon and stuff below through like Fischer trough synthesis or other kinds of chemical synthesis. But it's very difficult to imagine purely getting everything you need from this internal synthesis. And it seems a bit of a shame to miss out on all these amazing organics being delivered from outer space. And the last one as well is these deep sea vents, they lack complexity. When you look at even the most simplest cell or some of the reactions needed to make a cell, they require really complex conditions. For example, if you want to make ribose, which is one of the parts of RNA, which is an important part of all life on Earth, you have to use it generally through the foremost reaction, which is really alkaline conditions. But then if you want those individual bits of RNA to link up to form long chains like we have today, you need really acidic conditions. So that's an example. You need to have two different complex environments right next to each other where one chemical can cook up somewhere and mix to somewhere else, and of all these different, combinations of chemistries that can make the complexity of life. When you think about it, complex life really needs a complex environment to form. With that in mind, these vents are really chemically amazing, and you have this point source of all this incredible, chemical energy being produced from these vents, but that just dissolves out into a dilute ocean. There's not a lot of mixing between really different, complex systems other than the vent system itself and the water. So you have a single really strong, pH gradient between these really acidic or these really alkaline vents and the water. But after that single transition, you don't have a lot of remixing. You don't have a lot of different environments coming in together. So that's some of the limitations. One of the most interesting limitations in my mind, it's a bit paradoxical, is that the oceans are actually too wet. So there's this thing called the water problem or the water paradox, and Nicholas Hard from Georgia Tech supplied us with these amazing slides. And basically, if you want to link bits of the building blocks of RNA or DNA together into long chains, you need to kick water out. Every time you link it up, there's a H on one side and an OH on the other, and they form together to go H2O, and that has to leave, and then you can make these long chains. However, if you're surrounded by water and there's water always constantly pushing back into that reaction, it's really hard to drive the water off and make these long chains. And that's the same for making proteins and carbohydrates. Really, anytime you want to make a long polymer or a long chain, removing water from the system is the most effective way. So really, what other environments have the benefits of these hydrothermal vents, all that exciting chemistry, but none of the limitations? And the answer really is hot springs. I guess I mentioned that before, but I'm very excited by hot springs. So I think that may be the answer to a lot of these problems with these deep sea vents. So here's a cool little video that I took in New Zealand. And you can see here that that's a geyser going off. And these hot springs are almost like a deep sea vent, but on land. And there's water splashing up everywhere. You also have these amazing bubbling mud pools where over time, you can hear them bubble, which is kind of neat. Well, over time, all the rocks underneath get dissolved and totally turn into clays, and they're constantly bubbling, creating rich organic systems, making little bubbles of clays and muds that can mix together and have these really exciting reactions. These are photos from Puga. So this is a hot spring system up in Ladakh that Sid and I visited in 2016. And you can see here again, there's geysers, there's pools, there's water running off, really complex chemistry happening. But the most exciting thing is that these hot springs that have geology, to have those hot rocks delivering all of the nice chemicals you need for bacteria to eat up and to make life. You have evaporation. So for that, if you want to make those long chains of polymers to remove that water to make those chains work, you can actually have evaporation. As the water dehydrates and evaporates away, you can make those long chains work. You also have sunlight. So it's very easy for life evolving to start off chemically needing food and then to evolve with sunlight because there's chemicals and sunlight in the same place. But most importantly, these hot springs have complexity. So you can see here, this is an aerial footage of an amazing hot spring site called Oraki Korako in New Zealand. It's an incredible name, an incredible site. And you can see here, all of those arrows are individual pools that are mixing with one another. So when we talked about before how you need complexity for life to form, you need these different environments of mixing and you need stuff going backwards and forwards. Maybe these hot springs, all these pools going into each other might provide that. As we said before, you have these really complex systems where you need lots of pools of fitness, lots of different places where different chemistry can happen, all mixing together. So how complex are these pools? You can see here, this is a pretty average muddy pool from a hot spring in New Zealand. There's some people on the left there to give a bit of a scale. And we went along, myself, Martin, my supervisor, Martin Van Kranendonk, Kathy Campbell, and a whole bunch of her students. We went around and tested the chemistry in all these different pools. And even though they look kind of muddy and kind of all the same, they're actually not. So you can see here, we went around and we tested all these different pools. We mapped them out. This was just basic pH, temperature, salinity, everything we can get with a simple pH probe on the day. And you can see there's quite a lot of difference there. And two that are really interesting are these two down here where the boxes have come up in red. So you have that really little pool down the bottom. There's a pH of 5.5, so only slightly acidic, but it's 92 degrees Celsius. So it's nearly boiling. It's incredibly hot. And that's flowing down almost 10 centimeters away to a pool that's 3.1 pH, so a bit more acidic, but only 45 degrees Celsius. So you could have something that, a chemical that requires high temperature to form in that little pool, and then all of that's constantly getting put down into this cooler pool that's a bit more acidic, that might cook something up. And then over time, that's all flowing down into this lake, which is a pH of 2.5. So that's getting quite acidic now, but it has all this different feeder stock, all these different hot springs feeding in different chemistries coming down into that lake. So if you think about those complex environments creating complex biology, even a small pool like this, just 10 meters across, has already a really complex system. You can imagine that over hundreds of meters or over kilometers, all these different pools mixing into one another could generate amazing amount of complexity that may be able to promote life. So these hot springs and our understanding of them is shaping some nice new experiments. A classic one was with Dave Dima. In 2006, he went up to a hot spring system in the north of Russia, because people are very protective of the hot springs. They don't want people pouring in, experiments and doing random chemical stuff in there. But up in Russia, they had a military base full of hot springs. And they said, you know what, just go up there and do what you want. So we got a cup of primordial soup. He got a cup that was full of DNA and RNA and these lipids, and he mixed them all together, put them in a hot spring. And really quickly, he saw that these hot springs, they can undergo wet-dry cycling. They can form these little protocells. And over time, as that pool dries down, you can drive the water off and make these long chains of RNA forming, which is some of the first steps to forming life. So Bruce Damer and Sudha Rajamani were really important in this research as well. And now they're going on and doing more of this kind of work to really understand if you put, the soup that would have been around on the early Earth, delivered from these meteorites that cooked up underground, what would happen if they went into a just the average hot spring pool, and you really see quite complex chemistry coming out. These are some samples of protocells that I formed in hot springs in New Zealand. So basically, if you put in those lipids, so there's these fatty acid chains that like to make these nice little vesicles, these nice little membranes forming in our, in the right conditions, the right pH, the right salinity, they form almost immediately in these hot spring pools, which is very exciting. The next exciting thing is that if you put some RNA in there or some DNA, some genetic material, and you dry all of those lipids down, you dry those bubbles down, you evaporate them down, and then you rehydrate them, you can actually take all of that RNA and stick it inside. And you can see here, this is a close-up of green fluorescent RNA inside one of those red fluorescent vesicles. And you can see quite clearly that you can cram all of this RNA inside these vesicles purely by drying them down and concentrating all that RNA and then rehydrating and letting out all that RNA get stuck inside those vesicles. And when you see pictures like that, you can start to think of them as protocells, as genetic information inside a nice little membrane. And it's not too hard to think of going to that next step to something like this, which is a really primitive cell that Sigma Aldrich has got a nice image of, that they have a glowing bit of genetic material, a bit of protein inside that encased by these lipid layers. And even though it's a long step from these purely protocell balls of genetic code and a membrane around them. It's the first baby steps where you can do that 100, 1,000, a million times, bubbling around in these hot springs. These protocells might start to evolve to form life that we know it as today. So that's a really exciting experiments that are going on in that field, all based off our understanding of the geochemistry and of the environmental systems produced in these hot springs. So the next question is, if these modern hot springs are so good at making life, potentially, to have all of the right conditions for making long strands of RNA, encapsulating them in together, were these hot springs actually present on the early Earth? Were they actually around when life was forming? So to do that, we go back as far as we can in the fossil history and understand what are some of the first environments and what are some of the first fossils of life that we have on Earth. And really, the first fossils are these things called stromatolites. So that picture there, they're not actually fossils, they're living, they're growing stromatolites. It's amazing to think that some of the oldest life that we know of on Earth is still alive pretty much today. It survived all of that time, which is incredible. So these stromatolites form by really having little sticky layers on their surface that are photosynthetic. And as sand rains down on them, the sand sticks to the layers and covers up that photosynthetic material that wants to get sunlight. So then that material, those little sort of algal mats, these mats of bacteria, they then grow on top of that sand to form the next layer. And then the sand comes down and they grow to the next layer. So it's not like coral. They're not like actively building up the chemical little building around them. It's a passive process of sand grains trickling down, hitting these things. They say, well, we don't like these sand grains. We want to get on top of them. They grow another mat on top and they kind of build up over time to make these nice, long, lumpy kind of structures. So these are modern ones and these are how they work. But as you go back in time, you can see them really clearly in the fossil record. So these are fossils from the Pilbara in Western Australia, and they're 2.7 billion years old. And you can see in these fossils that you have those nice ripple marks going along all the way, but it is these big rounded structures sticking up between those ripples, which are those stromatolites growing up. Now, we don't only have the structures to go off. There are amazing types of organic chemistry. So you look at the organics trapped within those layers. You look at the rare earth elements or different elements that they're concentrating in them. So there's lots of lines of evidence to show that these things are actually fossils and they preserve what life was like 2.7 billion years ago. What we can do, we can go back even further to 3.4 and even 3.5 billion years ago. As most of you would know, the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, and the first half a billion years was known as the Hadean because it was so hectic. It was like the Greek underworld of Hades, You had meteorites smashing into it. You had a huge collision that formed the moon. So really, for life to be forming in 3.5 billion years ago is some of the earliest life that you could imagine that could get going in that process. So these are these little stromatolites as kind of a side-on layer. We can see them growing up over time. So when you think about what environment did these fossils grow in, a lot of people used to think for a long time there were environments like this. There were these shallow marine environments where you had sand and rippling sand, water overhead, dropping down little bits of sand on them. And that made sense because the modern stromatolites we see, they are forming in, these marine environments as well. And a lot of the fossils going back to 2.7 and even 3.4 billion years ago, they were forming in these shallow marine environments. They could tell really that they were forming purely underwater. There wasn't any exposed land, and it was really kind of like a coral reef, all underwater. But that all changed when this amazing person came along, Tara Jokic. So she just finished a PhD last year at the Australian Centre of Astrobiology. So she was really came before me. We only had a few years overlapping in our research, but she's a real pioneer in this field. So I spent my first time when I was 20 years old out in the Pilbara looking at these fossils, and she was there as well as a master's student. And that was right after she discovered these incredible rocks that totally flipped this idea of the environment in which life formed in on its head. So basically she found this rock here. This is a nice close-up of this rock. And it was this kind of laminated kind of black and white stripes on top of each other. They weren't stromatolites. They weren't living fossils, but they had lots of anatase and titanium and bits of clay alternating backwards and forwards. Now, she found this rock. She was walking around in the Pilbara with Martin, our supervisor, And she was just like, what are these rocks? You know, I kind of see them in this little thin band associated with the stromatolites, but not the stromatolites. What do you think they are? And Martin, he's a pretty chill guy. He's like, oh, I don't know. Why don't you just grab a sample, take it back to the lab, we'll figure out what's going on. So the two of them started this adventure trying to understand what these rocks were. And after years of research and geochemical analysis and comparing it to different rocks, they had someone come along and said, oh, I think that looks like this rock called geyserite. So geyserite is a rock that forms around the splashing geyser of a hot spring. So you can imagine underneath a hot spring, there's all this hot water that's bubbling up. It's kind of leaching out. It's sucking out all of the elements, all of the silica from the rocks below and bringing them up to the surface. Then at the surface, that water splashes around into little pools. And as it evaporates and as it cools down, all that silica and all those other elements, they precipitate out and they drop out to form these layers. So you get these hard layers of alternating stuff that gets splashed up and dried down and splashed up and dried down, forming these really thin little layers around most hot spring geysers. And that's exactly what we found in the Pilbara in Western Australia. So looking at that, combining it with all this other geochemical analysis and looking at the hydrothermal vents below the Pilbara, they really came to understand that that geyserite that's 3.5 billion years old was forming right on top of fossilized microbial mats or stromatolites. So really, Tara and Martin and others, Kathy Campbell included, and a lot of other hot spring experts, they put forward this idea that some of these hot springs 3.5 billion years ago, some of the oldest evidence of life we have in the world, wasn't forming under the ocean. It was actually forming on land in hot springs. That hot springs were around right when life was getting started and life was actively growing in these hot springs. This was, as you can imagine, an incredible step forward for the science. Tara, when she was a master's student, so not even a PhD student, she got a first name article in Nature Communications, which is, in my mind, incredible. It's just such a testament to the amazing work she does. They also got their research put on the front cover of Scientific American. So they really changed the idea that life was growing really early on in hot springs, and these hot springs could have produced the first chemical reactions needed for life to form. So we're not saying that life formed in the Pilbara in these hot springs. The fossils there are quite established, but at least it's showing that as far back as you can look, as far back as you can go into the origin of, as far back as you can go into the record of life on Earth and the record of environments on Earth, what environments are around, both life and those environments were forming in hot springs, which is super exciting and really supports the prebiotic chemistry. You know, you have people like Dave Deamer and Bruce Damer coming along saying that you need hot springs to create the chemicals needed for life. And then you have people like Tara and Martin coming along saying, well, the oldest life we have formed in a hot spring. It's two kind of nice convergent layers of information, bits of, proofs, as you were, coming together, solidifying this concept that life might have started in a hot spring. So with all of that in mind, we've got to really think about where's the astro in all of this biology. If this is an astrobiology talk, if I call myself an astrobiologist, where is the link from these hot springs and these fossils to life on other planets? And really, it's right here in the place called Columbia Hills in Gusev Crater on Mars. So there's an amazing story about the Spirit rover that I will not do justice to at all. But basically, the Spirit rover going around 2006, 2007 on Mars, one of its wheels froze up and couldn't work properly and started dragging its wheel. And because it was dragging its wheel, it almost acted like a plow or as a shovel dragging behind it and could sort of unearth bits of rocks underneath it and kind of see what the back was. So Steve Ruff and Jack Farmer, two really amazing, scientists who are working on all the images and all of the information coming back from the Spirit rover, were looking at some of these rocks and they were like, wow, they actually look a bit like a hot spring. So they did a lot of research, they did a lot of analysis, and they looked up really closely. So these are pictures from the Spirit rover from Mars, and you can see that you have these kind of knobbly rocks. They're made out of silica and they form these things called Digitate nodules. So they're kind of these little rocky things sticking out. And if you compare that to hot springs in Earth, you can see here, these are from El Tadio, so these are hot spring in Chile, and they almost look exactly the same. They're made out of the exact same stuff, and they form in quite similar environments. So there might have been a big collision that created this crater called Gusev crater on Mars, and it was so hot and compact that all of the rock and any ice that was there or liquid water would have all melted, heated up, and come to the surface as a hot spring. So we know that impact craters can create hot springs. They can generate enough heat to create that. So we think on Mars, there might have been a hot spring. The rocks we've seen so far are pretty good evidence that you might have had a hot spring there based on these superficial manifestations of these sort of digitate nodule, these little silica bumps, but also from the bigger environment of looking at Gusev crater as a whole. So I will say that we do have these digitate nodule, these kind of like wrinkly silica fingers up at Puga hot springs in Ladakh. And really, from only spending 4 days up there doing my research, there's a whole range of different chemistries there and different structures forming. So there's a lot of research going in now trying to understand how these structures form, what environments do they need to form in, that we can really do a one-for-one comparison linking that back to these potential hot spring deposits on Mars and really think about, could there have been a hot spring on Mars? So not only are we saying hot springs on Mars would be very excited from an origin of life perspective, that life might have been also able to form on Mars because there were hot springs there. Hot springs do another really exciting thing for understanding life on other planets. So these are all microscopic images looking at those digitate nodules, those bits of silica, and in every one you look at, you cut open any one all around the world, you start getting these little encapsulated silica circles and kind of little filamentous squiggles, and they're actually all fossilized cells. So every time you see a digitate nodule forming, there's all these cells entrapped in it as well. We like to call them stromatolites because you imagine these cells growing, they're trying to either get sunlight or they're trying to get chemicals from the water, and all this silica comes along and encrusts it, it precipitates over the top. So then they grow to the next level. So they're kind of building up again the same way that our stromatolites did. And everywhere you look at those digitate nodules, or really at silica anywhere in hot springs, they always have these cells entrapped in them. It's a really hard question. It's a chicken or the egg, you know? Did the silica get there because the bacteria there is helping it produce? Or is there, did the silica come first and the bacteria comes later? But it's this interesting question that could these things form without biology? Is the biology just hanging on as a passenger, or is it actively forming these nice digitate, these nice sort of figurine nodules like you see up in Ladakh in India and elsewhere in hot springs? And if that's the case, if you only get these digitate nodules forming, if there's life around, if there's bacteria there to help them form and help them grow, then it's really weak evidence that there could be fossils inside these silica crusts on Mars. You cut open these kind of things on Mars and understand, is there life, is there cells encapsulated in that? So really, Bruce Damer, who's an amazing visionary and really pushing this idea of going to Mars and trying to look at these potential hot spring deposits, he likes to think of them, hot springs on Mars that is, as the first and last outpost. Maybe hot springs are where life forms. They have all this amazing chemical energy and this process to evaporate and form these protocells. But also because there's so much silica that can encapsulate, encapsulate these cells that are present and fossilize them over time, and maybe the last place that life formed and the best place to fossilize them. So we're really excited about these fossils on the potential fossilized hot springs on Mars. We want to go back there. And a lot of our team really campaigned for Perseverance rover that's landing there in a few weeks' time to go back to that site, get some samples of these hot springs, and really understand what's going on Mars with these fossilized hot springs. As you know, there were a few different landing sites. We had Jezero Crater, we had Columbia Hills, and Columbia Hills, where the hot springs were, was one of the 3 finalist landing sites that was debated by NASA. In the end, they decided on Jezero Crater because it's somewhere new. There's a lot of other exciting chemistry and geology going on there. We're a bit sad. We really want to go back to Columbia Hills, or maybe one day, I don't know, Elon Musk might pay for us to go over there and we can check out those hot spring deposits. But that doesn't mean that's the end for these fossils in the Pilbara. even after they chose Jezero Crater, we had all of the instrument scientists. So we had all of the different scientists working on the Perseverance rover that are, driving the ChemCam or the Pixel or all the different kind of instruments. They all came out to the Pilbara to look at the fossils we have there and really think about if these fossils were on Mars, because they're around the same time that when Mars was warm and wet, when Mars would have had similar conditions to what was in the Pilbara 3.5 billion years ago. Could we be able to see them? Could we get the Perseverance? Could it drive up there? Could its cutting, drilling implements get into that actual rock? They were really trying to see the outback Pilbara fossils as a test bed to what could have been happening on Mars. So even though they're not going to a hot spring site on Mars at the moment, there's still a lot of research that the Australian Centre for Astrobiology does with these groups in NASA. So just to summarize all of this so far, because I know we've kind of ran for a lot of different concepts. Vents, deep sea hydrothermal vents are really cool. They're amazing chemically. They're amazing with all the life growing down there, but they may not be where life actually formed because they're too dark, they're too salty, they're a bit boring from that complexity perspective, and there's not a way to really concentrate these organics delivered from outer space. So instead, maybe hot springs might be the place where life formed on Earth. Hot springs that can support a lot of chemistry, including that, linking up of individual building blocks to form long polymers, but also these wet-dry cycling can make these protocells. They can encapsulate RNA inside them. They have nice, geochemical systems that can produce some really exciting, rock formations like geyser art and bring up the right chemicals needed for life to form. If hot springs were where life formed, we have support and evidence of that, weak evidence of these hot springs found with the oldest life on Earth. So you go as far back as you can into Earth's history, and there was life there 3.5 billion years ago, as well as hot springs present, which is really good supporting evidence that life was at least growing in hot springs and adapted to that a long time ago. And finally, there are probably hot spring systems on Mars and other planets. As I said, you're going to have these impacts from big meteorites and stuff, creating hot springs. If there's ice there, it can melt that ice and create these nice geothermal systems that can liberate water, bring it to the surface, bring all that amazing chemical nutrients from below up to the surface, and maybe get life going on other planets. So that's kind of the 4 steps to where the field of research that I'm working in is at. Obviously, this is just a theory. There's lots of different ideas out there, but we're going to keep chipping away at it and hopefully one day understand that big question of how life formed on Earth a little bit better. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening in, and thank you so much for Sid for organizing this. And I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. So definitely fire away.
Thanks a lot, Luke. I think that was a perfect summary of all the work you have personally done, as well as all the exciting bits about how this is actually turning out to be more and more revolutionary. The more we're doing research in the field, the more we're understanding, and it's actually tilting in the favor of land being the actual source where life had actually started. So we have a few questions, and I thought I'll just go through them in the Q&A section, and feel free to jump in and select a question which you might think is more relevant or connected to the one that you might have answered to start with. So the first question I have is, shouldn't the first question that we need to ask when searching for the origin of life be what is life? So how does that research connect with the work that you are doing right now?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I guess that's one I skirted around. So it's actually quite difficult. If you talk to a lot of people, they have different ideas of what life could be. They always have this joke: if you get 100 scientists in the room and you ask them what is life, you get 100 different definitions. NASA had this idea about it being a chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution, but you think of like sterile animals like a mule, which can't have kids. Is that still alive? A virus is alive if they can't undergo, I guess, reproduction by themselves. There's all these really weird, interesting caveats in there. I think what we're doing in our research is just saying, let's think about the life that we know of on Earth in the systems that it is. So it's looking at, a bit of genetic material, a complex metabolism encased in a membrane that can go on and divide and replicate but also evolve over time and start to create all the life that we see today. Obviously, that's not all the life that could be out there. There could be life totally unknown to anything we understand on other planets. I guess it's just the easiest place to start, you know? So yeah, but it's a really good question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
That's all right. And that exactly right what you said. Moving on. So another question, how prehistoric are these crabs and stuff found around hydrovents? Are they ancient creatures or are they more modern?
Yeah. So I will caveat this that I'm a geologist, so my biology is purely out of books I read in my free time. So the crabs and stuff, they're quite recent, you know, it wouldn't be any later than the Cambrian explosion, you know, so maximum couple 100 million years ago, crabs and that kind of like crustacean, these bigger macro creatures would have been kicking around these vents. However, genetically, they can trace back, I guess, like bacteria and all of our tree of life. They can kind of go back and look at all the common aspects that we still share. And a lot of those aspects point to the first cells, or the first life that everything on Earth shares would have grown up in a, in a hot kind of environment. They would have been thermophile, sort of like living in hot environments. And they also might have been chemotropic. So they might have been eating chemicals and using that for their energy. So you could say, yes, that the oldest life that we are aware of genetically is similar to the life that still lives around vents now. It's unclear whether life, if it did evolve there, did it stay down the whole time and stuff trickled up to the surface, or did that come down quite recently? As you get these crabs and shrimps and tube worms and stuff, there are a lot more recent things that are evolving down there. So it's not like the isolated systems that evolved totally separately to what we have on Earth. There's actually quite a lot of genetic exchange between these deep sea vents and superficial animals and animals in the ocean. So I don't think, so I think genetically that's the best we know about the vents so far.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I have another question from Dominic. I'm not completely sure of the context, but perhaps we can try to work this out. He asks, don't they still use the oxygen that was produced on the surface and dissolved in the ocean's water, which would make them still indirectly dependent on the sun?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm not too sure about it. That's good, I guess. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, where does that oxygen come from? I don't know the answer, Dominic. I'm really sorry. I can do some reading for you, and I can have a bit of a Google and read a few papers and get back to you if you want me to. But yeah, I think the metabolism of these deep sea microbes, I only know on a very superficial level. I'm sorry. But yeah, Thank you for that question. It's really good.
Awesome. Question from Gaurav. Isn't there a possibility that RNA molecules originated from a more simple sugar molecule?
Yeah, no, definitely. So RNA, or like ribonucleic acid, the ribose component is actually a sugar, you know? So there was definitely like sort of sugar, when you think about like sugars as a molecule, there are definitely sugars involved in RNA forming. Whether that was more simple, we don't know. There's a lot of really exciting research looking at, was there anything other than RNA or different kinds of RNA? So like non-canonical RNA. So rather than having the base pairs we have today, having different chemicals attached to them that can have different kinds of coding. I guess basically the concept of polymers are really important because you need to have genetic material. I think everyone is aware of that you need to have a way of keeping code. And if you just have molecules floating around in a soup, it's hard to keep them in order, you know? You actually have to have them strung together so you can read them off in an order from left to right, from top to bottom, to make any kind of information. And it's interesting, Schrödinger, the physicist, he predicted that, you know, long before they even knew there was RNA around. This was in the 30s and 40s. He said there must be these long chains of molecules capable of holding information for life to form. So, yeah, definitely there would have been long chains of stuff. Whether that was simple molecules of sugars and kind of got more complicated, the jury's still out. People are still trying to decide that. Yeah. But yeah, thank you. Great question.
Awesome. All right. Another question from Suryendo. He's basically asking about the sequence of origination. Did RNA, DNA, and proteins arrive in a particular order? Did they coexist together? And also a connected question about what are your thoughts on early life origination in saline water of sea or in fresh water bodies, and why? Some of it
Yeah.
you've already answered, so yeah, I could probably just encapsulate.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So a lot of that hopefully was answered for you. I
Yeah.
guess as well, this question about was it RNA or DNA or protein first or whatever it was, that's a big point of argument, I guess, within the origin of life community. And people will stand by RNA being the most important or proteins being the most important. But in my mind, both of them were present as far as we understand. There were amino acids being delivered to the Earth by these meteorites. RNA, even though the process isn't really worked out yet, it's pretty clear that you can have prebiotic, just boiling up sugars and different kinds of nucleic acids over time, you can get RNA forming. So all that stuff would have been around anyway, coexisting in the same environment. So to say that it's one or the other, to me is a limitation because they'll both would have been there anyway, So yeah, I think people like to get siloed because they're protein specialists and that's all they think about. But it's that real holistic approach that I think's the most realistic in my mind. So, yeah.
I agree with you. Yeah, that's a good point. Another question from Manujendu, and he's mainly asking us about the use of simulation, computer simulations with or without machine learning for studying all of this work that you're into, and how important is it? And I guess maybe you could talk about the importance of doing work in the lab, connected simulation work, and then eventually doing the work in the field.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a great question. So, there's a lot of really special stuff going on in this space. There's Mason Hargrave, who's a good friend of mine and a PhD student at Rockefeller University in New York. He does amazing stuff modeling these RNA interactions and how they can polymerize over time. So there's definitely work in that space. Bruce Damer, who's a massive computer whiz, talks about the ability to, model these things. He's a bit, I guess, pessimistic in his mind that, a single molecule can have trillions of interactions every minute, and there's all these different ways they can fold and come together. And that's just a single protein molecule in water, If you have hundreds of different molecules and wet-dry cycles and mineral surfaces, these things get so complicated. With our current computing technology, you can't replicate it, I know Bruce was talking to people at Google and trying to figure out ways to develop what did he call it, like a Genesis drive or something, or like complex ways to understand how life formed using high level computing. But I think it's all beyond what we have at the moment. So yeah, that's definitely computing modeling is definitely important. But what you can do in a lab in 10 minutes with a test tube full of chemicals may take you 20 years to model. So I think lab work for now is still the quickest way to do it. So yeah, but it's a good question.
Awesome. Another question from a close friend of ours, Mark Morita. He asked,
hey,
in terms of understanding that spark for the origin of life, how do you really know what are important factors in an environment, since you really only know about what you have chosen to examine? For example, you sample for boron, but what is the effect of AS or substrate silicon?
Yeah, Mark, it's a brilliant question. As you know, Mark was working with me up in these hot springs in Ladakh, and we trudged across all of these really kind of like muddy, boiling pools for hours trying to collect samples for boron, And I think the issue here as a field is what I mentioned before about those silos, I got this grant and I became obsessed with boron and I went there and that's all I thought about. But there's all these other chemicals that were definitely present and either for better or for worse, doing something there, people are obsessed with arsenic or silica, all that kind of stuff. I'm really trying to, and many others are trying to work on a more holistic approach. So it's looking at not only trying to focus on one element, understanding how they all come in together, these really complex, messy chemistry systems, And it not only is that more realistic, but I think it's ways to get emergent properties, If you just have a very simple system, you can't get complexity forming, but it is all these things interacting together and rock substrates and silica and stuff, you can start getting the complexity we see in life today. So yeah, if we had more funding and a lot more scientists working on it and maybe a few less egos, maybe we can have different perspectives on these elements and get them all working together. But yeah, it's a brilliant concept, Mark. Thank you.
I'm going to add a few more Mark questions because he's written a few more. There's another one from Mark. He asks, what kind of time must be available? Do hot springs last long enough for all of the important chemistry to happen, or does the system need to be much more long-lived?
Yeah. That's a really good question, Mark. And I think that's one of the biggest, I guess, criticisms of this hot spring hypothesis is that they see these deep sea vents, they can exist for easily 100,000 of years. They can have these big mineral deposits over time building up hot springs because they're usually next to volcanoes or in these very turbulent tectonic conditions. They blow up all the time. There's a classic example in New Zealand that had these pink terraces, these amazing hundreds of meters of like silica deposit, travertine, like calcium carbonate deposited. And it was this beautiful thing. And tourists would go there in the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s. And they just blew up, one day, just like the right water pressure underneath, and they were lost, So a lot of people do say could life form in these systems. That being said, there are examples of hot springs lasting for, tens to, 50,000 years kind of thing that we know of. That being said, the geological record doesn't have many in them. The ones we found in the Pilbara in Western Australia, the ones that Tara found, they were the oldest by, I think, 3.2 billion years. So the most oldest hot springs we knew about before that were around like 200 million years ago or something. And now these are 3.2 billion years, so 3,500 million years older, So because they are exploding all the time, they happen in tectonic zones, they always fall apart. So it's a really good point. And yeah, the jury's still out how long these things can last for. So yeah.
And the final question from Mark is, place your bet, hot springs associated with convergent or divergent boundaries?
I assume that's within the convergent evidence around hot spring forming with life. Was that just a coincidence? Was that where life formed?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. It's so hard to know. And as I said, this field is so young, and pretty much all our science is just stabbing in the dark and trying to make a guess and back it up by some science, As I said, the hot springs that we have in the Pilbara, they're too young for life to have formed there, like there's already photosynthetic materials growing there and complex chemistry in these hot spring, in these fossils. So it would have been a much, much older. So to say really like life formed in these hot springs because life's growing in those hot springs now, I think you can't say that, I think it's just really showing that hot springs were around, which no one really knew about before they found them, and that life had adapted to them really early on. It's weak conjecture at best. I'll give you that, but it's still the strongest argument we have because there's no fossilized deep sea vents that old with fossils around them. There's no other evidence of environments that could support life forming being preserved that far back, so it's the best we have to go off. But no, it's a good point.
Another question from Abigail. Thanks for a fantastic talk. I was wondering how life expanded from the stromatolite stage.
That's a really good point.
I guess into unknown territories.
Yeah. And I guess for me, like as soon as even a stromatolite, it's boring because life's already evolved. Life's already created. Like from 3.5 billion years ago to now, it's all just like highlights reel of like the Cambrian evolution and explosion, and I don't know, octopus got developed somewhere, and then we got eyes, and like, so I'm really sorry I can't talk much about that.
I'm gonna get an evolutionary biologist for my next talk who can talk a little bit more about that, because I see a lot of questions that these astrobiology talks about things like how did life go from one stage to the other, and how was the environment affecting it, and things like that. But that's a good question, and we'll hold that question off, Abigail. All right, so Jordan asks, thank you for your talk. Do we know for sure that the oceans of the early Earth were salty?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Basically, no. No one really has any idea what the oceans were like. People do a lot of modeling papers. So there's papers out there based on, the amount of rock that was around, the amount of, dissolved sodium and other ions present that would have been just as salty or maybe 2 times as salty. But they'll be like, oh, it's from half as salty to 8 times. Like they put these wildly, conservative, I guess, like error boundaries on them. There's a bit of stuff looking at the types of, salt, like, evaporative deposits from going back in time, but you really can't go back too far. to really when life was forming. So people assumed the Earth was, the oceans were salty because they would have accumulated quite quickly of all that water there, all that rock, all those ions. They would have mixed within the first couple 100 million years. But basically, we don't know for sure. There's also questions about freshwater lakes and whether they might have had deep sea hydrothermal vents in them. So there may have been less salty conditions on Earth with these deep sea vents, even if they weren't in the ocean. So yeah, it's still so much of this stuff's conjecture. So I really can't give solid answers. I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Great
Yeah.
answer though. Anyways, another question. I'll just paraphrase the question. Basically, how do you think the ultraviolet rays or strong cosmic rays would affect, life starting in these terrestrial systems, and especially for Mars as well? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's difficult. They go both ways. Some people develop entire, pre-body chemical pathways to saying this is how you go from simple building blocks to RNA to life, powered by UV radiation, and they have lamps in their lab and they can use it to make new kind of molecules. Other people say, no, it's going to destroy all of your DNA and it's really not good. So it's basically what kind of chemistry you do depends on how you view that answer. To me, the exciting thing about hot springs is that you can have both, like silica is a really good, way of blocking sunlight. You can have these little organisms called hyperliths, bacteria living under silica that can live really easily in really high altitude conditions. So up in Ladakh, you have rocks that are quite thin made out of silica with bacteria living underneath it. So the silica blocks it out. If you have titanium as well, titanium and zinc are really good at blocking out UV radiation. But you also have these pools that are bathed in radiation with no titanium or zinc and stuff there. So in my mind, having an environment that can have UV radiation, but also the ability to protect themselves from it, gives you the best of both worlds, And then maybe over time, protocells can evolve to precipitate silica around them and protect them from that UV radiation so that they can, go on and be more Darwinianly productive or something. So really, it can totally go different ways. In my mind, why not have both? Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Alexandra asks, sugars are unstable in hot spring environments, but they are vital compartments of DNA and RNA. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. Basically, so the one sugars I know the most about is these sugars called ribose, and they form in these formose reactions. So pretty much you can cook up, cyanide and a few other kind of really simple organics. And then over time you can get, like complex sugars forming, but in alkaline conditions, they fall apart really easily. At high temperatures, they fall apart. Acid destroys them. Sugars are really unstable. The stuff that we look into are how can they be stabilized by their environment. So as Mark would know, I'm passionate about boron because borate, this dissolved kind of salt in certain waters, especially certain hot springs can concentrate it. It can bind with the ribose, it can bind with these sugars and protect them from, decomposing in highly alkaline conditions. So you can actually have, like minerals or geochemical components that can protect those sugars. So as we said, the origin of life wouldn't just been a whole bunch of sugar in a jar by itself. It would have had rocks and minerals and all those kind of things around. And for better or for worse, they might have protected it. So yeah, obviously, in these chemical-rich environments, sugars get destroyed, but hopefully boron can come along and save the ribose. And there's other examples for other sugars and molecules and stuff like that as well. So yeah, it's a good question. We don't know, but we're working on it. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Questions keep coming. I hope you have time, Luke, to take these.
No, yeah, maybe 5 more minutes or so, and then I have to run off. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So we'll select some of the good ones. So I actually saw a nice question in the chat box. So isn't it more? This is from Shatakshi. Isn't it more difficult for primitive life to form and adapt if there is so much difference in pH and temperature and complexity within a small area?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We like to think of complexity as a good thing because it means we can have our alkaline and our acidic reactions in the same place and sunlight and no sunlight, all that kind of stuff. But there comes a point where life wants to find its niche, wants to evolve in a really nice, calm environment. And Bruce Damer has thought about this a lot. And if you look at the Scientific American article, which I can send to anyone who wants it, I'll put my email address in the chat at the end of this. You can email me, I'll send it through to you if you can't get access to it. And it's kind of like this whole process where you have a hot spring cooking up all the chemistry and maybe life forming, but over time it would wash downstream, sort of come into rivers that are a bit more calm and eventually get washed out into the beaches and on the sort of the marine settings of the oceans, you know, where it's nice, calm and still and there's sunlight there, but none of these crazy chemistries. So yeah, over time, life could form in a hot spring and go down to these beach settings. The reason why life couldn't possibly form in these beach settings is that there's no really complex chemical energy. There's no way of concentrating these organics, and there's no wet dry cycling. You know, you might have tidal pools potentially, but that doesn't have the chemistry as well. So you can think of it as this nice kind of like flowing map over time where life formed in these chaotic conditions and then kind of washed downstream towards a nice calm environment. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to ask you a final question. Unfortunately, we can't take everyone's questions, but we will take them down. We will save them, and we will try to address them because we were just talking and we're working on an idea to have a hot spring series. I was just chatting with Sudha on the other side, and we might be having more hot spring related discussions. So I'll make sure that we get all of these questions answered. So a question from Debashri, who's actually at my lab currently. She asks, how old were the oldest rocks you found near the hydrothermal vents in Ladakh? And perhaps if you could also comment on, obviously, you know, you might not be able to visit us this year. We were just talking about it. But what are some of your initial thoughts about the follow-up work that you're planning to do in Ladakh?
Yeah, no, that's an amazing question. I'm happy you're giving me the opportunity to talk about the work you do in Ladakh, Sid, because and your team, because it's amazing work. So I guess basically up in Ladakh, the hot springs are quite new. You know, it's very, as we said, it's a tectonically very active space. There's these kind of rift valleys happening as it gets all sort of smished up together, all the rocks and cracks form, water trickles down, gets heated up and comes back up to the surface. So all the rocks around those hot springs are like couple 100,000 years max, you know, is that hot springs being there for. And there may be some like older granites and stuff that were underneath that, but nothing ancient like what we get in Australia. You do have quite old fossil stromatolites, and I know Dr. Mukund Sharma and others are working in that space, but they're elsewhere. They're not around these hot springs. Regarding those experiments, and Sid and I were talking about this before, I love the idea of doing science out in the field, you know, like you can never replicate what happens in the lab to what really happened, you know. You have vapor, you have mineral grains, you have this bubbling, you have all this mixing. So Bruce Damer, Dave Deemer, and myself, along with Sudha Rajamani and Manesh Joshi and a lot of other students and workers in this space, we're trying to bring hot springs into the lab. We're trying to get hot spring samples and bring them back to us, but also do research in the hot springs, you know? And I'm really looking forward to doing a whole bunch of experiments in these hot springs, you know? So hopefully next year when borders open up, I'll be up there in Ladakh with any other students that want to come up there, and we can take bits of RNA, we can take bits of, you know, ribose or sugars, put them in the hot springs and see, wow, does all the boron there actually stabilize those sugars in real life, not in some lab simulation, but realistically, you know? Also, a very exciting thing is looking at how these hot springs change over time. As Sid would know and Mark would know, I was there for 4 days and it was just very stressful, running around, get all the samples we can. But, you know, over weeks, over months, over years, these hot springs are constantly evolving and changing, you know? So, really trying to understand how that happens and really understand it in the winter. I'm excited to partner with local Ladakhi people who live around there. They can go there and study it all year round, not only because it'd be cool to see what happens when these hot springs are totally covered in ice, but Origin of Life researchers are very excited about this idea called eutectics. And basically that means when ice freezes, it can squish chemicals together and you get quite interesting chemistry forming in ice. And a lot of people think that Origin of Life in ice compared to hot springs, they're totally mutually exclusive. They can't happen together because hot springs are hot and ice has to be cold. But studying hot spring environments where you get ice forming right next to a hot spring pool and you might have 80-degree pool next to minus 20 degrees of ice, understanding how that works and how that interacts could be very exciting for thinking about the mixing between eutectic conditions and then hot spring conditions and how they can work compatibly. So yeah, hopefully I want to work with Sid and Suda and hopefully design some nice experiments for this year. And then next year I'll be up there with all of you having a lot of fun in these hot springs. So yeah, really exciting stuff.
Thanks a lot, Luke. And I would actually leave with this slide of ours for this year. So all of those listening in and who are interested in participating in some initial field work before Luke starts his work in 2022, we'd actually be putting up more information. We have an Earth and Space Exploration program that we announced in November. That is basically a science and education field program from June to October of this year. And we've kind of divided our work into 3 different themes: learning from the past, where we study formation of Earth, Mars, and also probably including topics such as the origin of life, the terrestrial evolution, and focusing then on the present. So we will have some work where we'll try to understand what does the recent changes in the climate do to the surface, the environment, the atmosphere, and finally looking at the preparations for future. So training for Moon and Mars, which will be more focused on instrumentation and robotics and different kinds of capabilities that we would be really needing to prepare for Mars exploration and Moon exploration. So this information has already been out there. For those of you who haven't looked at it, I encourage you to look at the 2 URLs. I'll just post it also in the chat window. And we were actually quite fortunate to have been promoted by the NASA Astrobiology program. They've listed us as a funding opportunity on the NASA Astrobiology page and also sent out an emailer about us. So this is an opportunity both for participants as well as experienced field scientists who are prepared to take out time and spend 3 to 4 weeks at the minimum and almost up to 2 to 3 months if they are able to, and lead teams of students. And it's a great opportunity for people to explore and be a part of this developing field of work that we are setting up in Ladakh. So I encourage everyone to apply and also share it amongst their networks. We will be receiving applications until the 15th of February, so 2 more weeks.
Yeah.
So
I'll just say, Sid, I can't recommend working with Siddharth and doing that project enough. It's the most amazing site up there. Working with Sid and Mark and all the other team up there were the most incredible group of scientists. And if you have the opportunity to go either as a student or as a teacher, just do it. You'll have the best time. It's amazing. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Very kind to hear that from you. And I'm really excited to know that you're continuing and you're really motivated in this field. And I really hope all the positive energies go to you and don't let anything get to you and just keep at it, man. This is just great work that you're involved in.
No, thank you, Sid. And I will say, I just put my email address in the chat. So if anyone has any more follow-up questions about my research or want me to send them papers or anything, do it. Or if you want to, if you're thinking of going up to Ladakh with Sid and you want to talk about experiments that you could do or organize up there, I'm always excited to collaborate. So definitely let me know. I'd love to be involved. So yeah, send me a message. Sure. Let's get in contact.
Which email should I use?
So it's l.steller@unsw.edu.au. I think I'll put in the chat as well, but feel free to share that around. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I think it's there. Perfect. Great. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Luke, for your time. And we look forward to having a discussion offline about all the work we're setting up. And thanks to all the attendees who have taken out time on a weekend to listen to us. And we will be back next month with another speaker. So stay tuned, stay in touch, and let us know if you have any questions. We're here with all the astrobiology information. So thank you and have a nice day or evening to everybody.
Thanks, Sid. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye-bye.